Sure. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for having me on your show. I'm excited to try out my first podcast with you guys.
Mhm.
So my name is Alisa Melekhina. I am a women's international and FIDE master in chess, and I'm also currently a corporate litigator practicing in New York City. Sure. Well, let me break down your question a bit because you mentioned a few concepts, strategy, tactics, and thinking ahead.
Mhm.
And those are all a big part of chess, and they come into play in different ways. And there's also a bit of confusion between strategy and tactics because the
Right.
concepts are used interchangeably sometimes, but they're quite different. So when you talk about tactics with a chess player, what we think of immediately are, combination sequences, something like a two-move checkmate. I don't know if your audience has experience in chess, but if they study chess puzzles, very basic chess puzzles will be find the checkmate in two or find the way to win the queen. So those are tactics, and those are very short-term sequences of moves, usually a four sequence of moves, especially if it's a checkmate. It's usually going to be check. It's going to force a king move. Another check will lead to checkmate. And strategy is different because strategy is the overarching plan of the game, and it's designed to achieve the ultimate goal, which is usually going to be checkmate, of course, but you can have different strategic goals to achieve mini goals. And tactics can be part of your overall strategy. So a very basic strategy that some players can have in their approach to the game is they perceive themselves as more aggressive or attacking players. So then part of their strategy will be to pick opening sequence of moves that will give them the type of aggressive positions they're comfortable in. And within those positions, more tactics will arise, as opposed to a player who likes more closed, slow positional styles. And so their strategy will involve choosing different opening sequences and then different ways of playing or trying to psych out their opponents. Right, and that goes to the other concept you mentioned about thinking in terms of steps ahead.
Mm.
So when you conceive of a chess game, the end goal is always the same. It's to win. It's by checkmate. Or you can win by forcing your opponent to resign if you win a lot of material. And in fact, in high-level games, the chess game will rarely conclude with the resignation. Usually someone will win a decisive amount of material, like a rook or a queen or even, a knight or a bishop, and that will force the other player to resign because they know that if they played on at this high level, they're going to lose eventually. So they would resign as a sign of respect and as a practical matter. So that's your overall psychological goal in terms of seeing ahead in a chess game. But when you're actually at the board and analyzing moves, a good player would be able to see, I would say, maybe between 4 to 6 moves ahead, just based purely on calculating brute force. I go here, he goes there. But that doesn't necessarily make you a good chess player because, like you mentioned in chess, there are so many possibilities. I think a figure that people like to use is that the number of legal moves in the chess game exceeds the number of atoms in the universe for the number of possible positions that can arise. So it's obviously impossible to calculate all possible lines. So the better player will be the one who can evaluate the tree variation better than his opponent. So both opponents can maybe see 4 moves ahead, but how do you decide to go with that move versus a different move that will lead to a different line? Absolutely. Computers have changed the way chess is played, both good and bad. So maybe 10 or 15 years ago, humans were still competitive with computers. We had that famous match, Kasparov versus IBM, and he was still able to keep up with the computer. But nowadays, computers are vastly stronger than a human chess player, and they will win in the match. So there have been some advancements to counter playing with a computer, but in using technology. So Garry Kasparov has formed this concept of advanced chess where you have a human and a computer paired against another human and a computer. And the idea is that the computers will neutralize each other out, and then it'll depend on the creativity of the human in being paired with the computer. So that's one way, and that's just because the computers are so strong that playing against the highest level will unfortunately be futile. But using computers has transformed the way that chess is played and studied. So back in the day, you didn't have computers checking lines, analyzing lines. Back in the day, like the matches that Fischer played and so forth, after they reached a certain move in the game, move 40, they would adjourn the game, and then they would bring in their coaches in seconds and analyze the position, and then come back the next day and continue the game. And of course, you can't do that these days because everyone would just use a computer and there would be no point. But what you do now is you use computers as part of your home preparation in order to vet openings and sequences. And so when you come to the board, you're more prepared. You're not going to lose in the first 20 moves of the game usually because you would have checked all of these lines with the computer at home.
Right.
So that definitely helps advance chess theory, and it helps you learn the game quicker. But the flip side of that, and what we see happening at the higher levels, is that it's making the games more dry and slow, because all of that creativity that used to come with chess, all those sacrifices and attacking games, if your opponent is prepared for it, it won't work. So now you see people playing a bit safer. Oh, yeah, sure. Well, my firm handles a lot of intellectual property litigation. And one of the cases I worked on was for a client that made the video Grand Theft Auto. So that was an interesting case because that was an appeal that we were taking from the state court. And I can only comment on what's in the public record and what the final decision was. But in general, as applied to this case versus as applied to other cases, I find that litigation strategy is very similar to gaming strategy that would underlie a competitive game like chess. And a lot of the litigation is anticipating what the other side knows and what procedural devices they're going to use. And I think of procedural devices in litigation, like filing certain motions, to be similar to tactics within chess. And then each side has their own strategy of, which facts they're going to focus on, how they're going to raise these facts to the witnesses, what exactly they're going to introduce into the record for evidence, and how that's going to play out. And they're either aiming for a victory in the courtroom or aiming to get leverage in settlement. But there's definitely that interplay. Right. I would say the variation is more due to unpredictability of what the judge will decide in a particular instance. So both the law is the same for both sides, even though unless the issue is a conflict of laws issue in terms of which law do we apply in this situation. But usually that will be resolved. So you're operating within the same legal framework, but then you're not exactly sure, how is the judge going to interpret my legal argument? How are they going to rule? And what will be the effect of this? And that's what you're trying to operate is within that framework. Right. Well, I've mentioned openings a few times already, and the opening sequences, it's basically the theory of chess. It's the first few moves that have been vetted throughout time and through experience, and they have different names. A common name for one opening is the Sicilian defense.
Right.
A lot of people will hear about it. It's when white moves their king's pawn up to e4, black replies with pawn to c5. That's the starting position of the Sicilian defense opening. And some people think that white has the advantage because they are the first player to move, and so they can almost decide on the opening. And if you decide the opening, then you can shift the game into your territory.
Right.
So theoretically, it may be the case that white does have a slight edge, but in practice, black has devised ways to counter that. And that's why you see all of these openings, such as the Sicilian defense, are playing indirectly against white's central control. So white opens with the central pawn, and instead of mimicking that to go into a symmetrical position where white's first move advantage really would stand out, they go into these more circuitous openings where they're playing indirectly against white. So that should neutralize the first move advantage somewhat. That's all based on this underlying principle of every move has to have a purpose. And a lot of beginner players, they get frustrated because they think that the immediate purpose of chess is to checkmate or win material. But if you're playing against someone who knows a bit about chess, you're not going to be able to checkmate them so quickly. So then you have to come up with other purposes for the pieces, and what are they going to do in the meantime? So one purpose is to develop your pieces to control the center, as we discussed. And then once they're out there, then the next question is, what do you do? And then that's when you get into more complex chess strategy. You start to look at the strengths you have in your own position, the weaknesses that your opponent has, and then you think, how do I exploit their weaknesses? So maybe they have a pawn that's unprotected, and you attack that pawn, and you think, how can I win that pawn? And then once you win that pawn and you're material up, then there's different strategy for converting the advantage of being up material. So this is what I mean when I say that chess is full of a conglomerate of strategies leading to the ultimate goal.
Have you noticed a lot of success in your play in regards to like sacrifices or gambits?
I definitely like playing Gambits. It's funny because I started out as a player who played very symmetrical, dry, slow openings. You wouldn't get an advantage, and then would end up in an end game, which is where the queens are off the board and it's just few material left. And then as I got older and started playing more tournaments, I picked up Gambits here and there, and I noticed that they are a lot more creative than the openings that I was playing. And it definitely makes the game more enjoyable, and they're more of a practical weapon. So you don't see Gambits played as much on the high level. So the recent World Championship match that took place in New York City between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karyakin, there were no Gambits played because, as I mentioned about computers, computers will usually vet these gambit lines. If you sacrifice material, these players are too well prepared. So gambits work better, I'd say, at lower levels, but even at my level of chess, which is the master level beneath the grandmaster level, you can definitely catch your opponent off guard in those. Yes, castling is a very important move, a very important developing move. And when chess first started, it wasn't possible to castle, which is when you take your king and you can move it over 2 squares and then have your rook jump over the king. And so it's like basically you're making almost 3 or 4 moves within one to get this defensive position. And I think that this innovation of castling was invented because if the king is stuck in the center without the protection of having it castled, it's privy to being attacked. And a lot of games can end quickly if your king is unprotected and in the center and falls prey to an attack. So players that don't castle and waste time with non-developing moves often lose quickly because their king is unprotected.
In terms of that, like I noticed that there, I guess from a business perspective is that even if you were to reach like a grandmaster state, I'm assuming that there's not that much money ultimately that you can make by doing this. Why do you think that's the case? Because, it seems like a pretty hard profession to be competitive in, and there's so much other competitors as well. So you would imagine that something as rigorous as chess would get, you would find the same kind of financial rewards of, say, for example, excelling in that profession.
Yeah, you would hope that people would appreciate more of what chess has to offer. But if you're one of the top elite players like Magnus Carlsen or
Right.
Those players are the top 10 in the world, they do have private sponsorships and they are pretty well off. But for everyone else who doesn't make it to the top, it is very difficult to make money from chess. And in fact, when I play chess competitively, it's always a losing proposition for me financially because of the cost to enter a tournament, to travel to the tournament, the time it takes to play a tournament. And chess tournaments, they last a week or so, and
Right.
one game is 6 hours. I think part of the problem with all of this is that chess is considered a bit erudite. It's not accessible to everyone, and it's difficult to appreciate everything that goes on in high level chess. So, I mean, these guys are playing for 6 hours, and you really have to know a certain level of chess in order to appreciate all of the intricacies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you know basically how to play, what you can do now is follow the commentary, and there's this innovation in chess where there's live commentators like there would be on the sports broadcast. And you can follow that and follow along with the game, but part of it, I think, is, chess games, they're too long.
Right.
Like for 6 hours, and they're not keeping up with the times. And also, chess personalities need to step up and improve their profile. A lot of chess players keep to themselves, and when they talk, it's all about chess. And I think there's this missing gap between relating chess to real life, and that's part of the disconnect.